The morning my stepson's personnel file landed on my desk, the room fell into a sudden, heavy silence. It wasn't because anyone else in the room recognized the name, but because I did. Commander Ethan Collins, United States Navy, my husband's only son. This was the same man who had spent the last 3 years whispering behind my back, telling anyone who would listen that I had only married his father for the money. The same man who once stood at a crowded family gathering, raised a champagne glass, and joked that while some women marry for love, others marry for beachfront property. He was the same man who had never once bothered to ask what I actually did for a living. Now, his entire professional life sat less than 3 feet from my right hand. Inside that folder were allegations serious enough to trigger a formal high-level review. Around the conference table, my colleagues remained oblivious to the connection. None of them knew the officer under scrutiny was my family. None of them knew that for years, I had endured his subtle insults with a polite, practiced smile, and nobody knew that the hardest battle of my career wasn't happening in some far-off theater of war. It was raging inside my own chest. I wasn't just his stepmother, I was the Navy Inspector General. The code of conduct that had guided my 35-year career demanded one thing above all: absolute fairness. No favoritism, no revenge, no exceptions, not even for those who shared my last name. I stared at the file for a long moment. Then I opened it. For the first time in my life, I honestly didn't know which would win my heart or my training. Part 1. The gold digger in my own home. People often assume that power changes you. In my experience, power doesn't change you, it reveals you. The older I get, the more I believe that truth. My name is Margaret Collins. I am 58 years old. For 3.5 decades, I served in the United States Navy. Most people who met me in civilian clothes would never guess my rank or my history. I preferred it that way. After decades of uniform ceremonies, deployments, and the heavy weight of command responsibility, I found that anonymity was one of life's greatest luxuries. 3 years before Ethan's file appeared on my desk, I married Richard Collins. Richard was 62 at the time, a successful businessman based in Virginia Beach. He owned a construction firm that specialized in government contracts and large-scale commercial development. He was also a widower. His first wife, Susan, had passed away after a grueling battle with cancer. By the time I met Richard, we were both at an age where we knew exactly what mattered and what didn't. Neither of us was looking for a whirlwind romance. We were looking for peace. Our relationship developed with a comfortable, steady rhythm. Coffee became lunch. Lunch became dinner. Dinner became companionship. And eventually, companionship became love. There was no drama, just 2 people who had lived enough life to recognize something genuine when they found it. Richard proposed on a quiet evening overlooking the Chesapeake Bay. No audience, no photographers, no grand, sweeping gestures. Just honesty. That is probably why I said yes. The only complication was his son, Ethan. At the time, Ethan was 28 years old, tall, confident, and handsome. He was the kind of young officer people naturally followed. A Naval Academy graduate, he was already building what looked like an impressive career. Richard adored him. From everything I had heard, I fully expected to like him too. I was wrong. The first time Ethan met me, I felt the chill immediately. He wore a smile that never quite reached his eyes, and his handshake felt like a chore he was being forced to complete. His questions sounded polite on the surface, but they were sharp underneath. "What exactly do you do, Margaret?" I offered a neutral smile. "I work for the Navy." His eyebrows lifted slightly. "Doing what exactly?" "Administrative oversight." It wasn't technically a lie, but it wasn't even close to the whole truth. He simply nodded and glanced toward his father. Something shifted in his expression, a look of dismissive realization. I didn't understand it then. I would later. The wedding was a small affair with family and close friends. Richard wanted simplicity, and so did I. Yet, even before the honeymoon ended, the whispers had begun. They didn't come from strangers. They came from Ethan. At first, I heard it through the grapevine. An aunt would mention something awkward. A cousin would change the subject too quickly when I walked into a room. A family friend would look at me with a pained expression of embarrassment. Eventually, the truth surfaced. Ethan believed I had married his father solely for his wealth. The accusation caught me off guard, not because it hurt my feelings, but because it was so patently absurd. My military pension alone was larger than the annual salaries of many Americans. I owned my own home outright, and my investments were rock solid. I had spent decades earning every cent I possessed. Yet, in Ethan's mind, I was nothing more than a gold digger. Richard wanted to confront him several times, but I always talked him out of it. "He's still grieving his mother," I told Richard. "Margaret, it's been years," he sighed. "People carry grief differently. They find targets for it." Richard shook his head. "You give him too much grace." Maybe I did. Or maybe I just remembered what it was like to be young, and convinced that I understood the world better than I actually did. For a long time, I hoped Ethan would come around. Instead, he doubled down. Family barbecues became exercises in patience. Every gathering included some new barb, some jab disguised as a joke. At one Thanksgiving dinner, he asked if retirement was treating me well. When I told him I wasn't retired, he laughed. "Must be nice not needing to work." Several relatives suddenly became very interested in their mashed potatoes. I simply smiled. Another time, he made a loud joke about the importance of prenuptial agreements. Nobody laughed, especially not Richard. Yet, Ethan never seemed to notice the discomfort he caused. The strange thing was, I actually admired him. He worked hard, served his country, and clearly loved his father. Beneath the arrogance, there was a decent man struggling with a resentment he couldn't quite name. I could see it, even if he was blind to it. The real turning point came during Richard's 65th birthday party at a waterfront restaurant in Norfolk. There were about 40 guests, friends, business associates, and retired officers. It was a lovely evening until Ethan started drinking a bit too much. His jokes became louder and his edges sharper. I was talking to one of Richard's friends when Ethan stood up and tapped a spoon against his glass. The room went quiet for the toast. It started off normally enough, a tribute to his father, childhood memories, and Navy football stories. Then his eyes locked onto mine. "Some women marry for love," he said, his voice carrying across the silent room, "and a lucky few marry for beachfront property." Absolute silence followed. I heard a fork hit a plate in the back of the room. Richard's face turned a deep, furious red. Guests looked horrified, glancing between Ethan and me. Ethan, however, looked incredibly pleased with himself, as if he had finally had the courage to say what everyone else was thinking. But they weren't thinking it, only he was. I didn't argue. I didn't lecture him. I simply raised my glass, took a slow sip of my drink, and smiled. The moment passed, and the party eventually resumed, but something inside me shifted permanently. It wasn't anger or resentment, it was acceptance. I finally realized that Ethan wasn't interested in learning who I was. He preferred the Vilitskanavtsakanavlis to I fend. Takari too, invented for me. No amount of truth can compete with a belief that someone desperately wants to keep. The next morning, as I packed my suitcase for DC, Richard drove me to the airport. We were silent for a long time. "I'm sorry," Richard finally said. "You didn't deserve that." He shouldn't have said it. I looked out the window at the passing trees. "He'll figure it out someday." Richard shook his head. "You still believe that?" "Yes." He laughed softly, though there was no humor in it. "You're a better person than I am, Margaret." Maybe. Or maybe 35 years in uniform taught me that people eventually become their own punishment. You don't usually have to help the process along. My flight left Norfolk shortly after noon. By evening, I was back in Washington, back to classified briefings, investigations, and oversight reviews. Back to the life of the Navy Inspector General that Ethan knew absolutely nothing about. As my government vehicle pulled away from the airport, I looked at the city lights and thought about the collision course of our two worlds. I had no idea that within months, those worlds would shatter against each other, and when the dust settled, Neither Ethan nor I would ever be the same. When people hear this story, they often assume I disliked Ethan from the start. That would make for a simpler tale, but it wouldn't be true. Despite his behavior, I wanted him to succeed. In many ways, Ethan reminded me of the talented young officers I had mentored throughout my career. Ambitious, intelligent, and confident. But confidence is a double-edged sword. It's necessary to command ships and sailors, but the danger arises when that confidence slowly curdles into entitlement. Entitlement is a quiet rot. It's hard to recognize until the floorboards start giving way. About 6 months after the birthday party incident, I attended a Navy leadership conference in Arlington. I was reviewing briefing materials in a large ballroom when I heard a familiar voice. I looked up to see Ethan standing with several other officers. He looked every bit the successful commander, relaxed, engaged, and respected. I watched him, not as a stepmother, but as a senior officer. His reputation was objectively strong. His evaluations were stellar, and many believed he had admiral potential. That isn't a phrase thrown around lightly. As I listened to him speak from a distance, I felt an unexpected flicker of pride. He had earned professional respect on his own merit. A few minutes later, he spotted me. His expression shifted instantly to that familiar look of uncomfortable dismissiveness. He walked over. "Margaret." "Ethan. I didn't know you'd be attending this." He gave a polite, hollow chuckle. "I'm a commander. This is where we're supposed to be. What brings you here?" I smiled. "I work for the Navy. Remember?" The joke sailed right over his head. He didn't ask for details. He just made a few harmless comments before returning to his real colleagues. I watched him walk away and thought, if he ever stopped judging people so quickly, he would be unstoppable. But back at home, nothing changed. Richard would tell me about Ethan's latest achievements over dinner, and I would listen patiently. I never wished him failure. Real revenge isn't about wanting someone to lose. Sometimes, it's simply refusing to become the person they've decided you are. Around that same time, small pings began appearing in the Navy's oversight channels. Nothing headline-worthy, just minor complaints. A subordinate felt ignored, a leadership decision seemed questionable, or an expense report needed clarification. Usually, these things are resolved at the local level. The first complaint involving Ethan was so minor I never even saw it. Case closed. Then came another a few months later. Still minor, still inconclusive. But for experienced reviewers, it wasn't the severity that caught their eye. It was the pattern. Different people in different locations were all describing the same thing. A commander who blurred professional boundaries, a leader who expected special treatment, and an officer who didn't take criticism well. One afternoon, Captain Rebecca Torres, one of the sharpest investigators I knew, dropped a folder on my desk. "Interesting trend developing here," she said. I glanced at the paperwork. "What am I looking at, Rebecca?" "A cluster of leadership complaints. Nothing actionable yet, but the frequency is unusual." I skimmed the pages. The names didn't mean anything to me yet. "What's your concern?" She leaned against my desk. "It's not a specific fact. It's a professional instinct." I laughed. After 35 years, I knew exactly what she meant. Sometimes you smell the smoke long before you see the fire. We moved on to other business, neither of us realizing that the folder was the first spark of a conflagration. 4 months later, on a cold, gray Monday in Washington, I arrived at my office to find a thick file sitting in the center of my desk. It was marked for senior review, a formal, high-level investigation. I looked at the name on the cover. My stomach tightened. Commander Ethan Collins. For several seconds, the world went quiet. The hum of the city outside faded. I opened the file and began to read the summary. By the time I reached the bottom of the first page, I knew this was no longer a family squabble or a misunderstanding over dinner. This was now a Navy problem. I sat alone, staring at the documents. The Navy doesn't care about feelings. The regulations don't care about stepmothers or beachfront property. Within the hour, I contacted legal counsel. The moment a personal connection is identified, it must be disclosed. I informed the officials that the subject was my stepson. Everything was recorded and reviewed. The lawyers determined that because of the multiple layers of independent oversight, I could remain involved in the preliminary process provided I maintained absolute objectivity. No special treatment, the lead counsel warned. No retaliation and no favoritism. That is exactly what I would expect, I replied. The initial allegations were about judgment and potential misuse of authority. As I dug through thousands of pages of travel records and command surveys, a clear picture emerged. Ethan's strengths were undeniable. He was brilliant and results-oriented. But his flaws were equally clear. He had become comfortable bending the rules, thinking they applied to other people, but not to him. Captain Torres came back into my office a few days later with a fresh stack of documents. She closed the door. "We did a deeper dive into his travel authorizations," she said, sitting down. "Individually, they're small shortcuts. An upgrade here, an unapproved reimbursement there. But collectively, it's a map of entitlement," I finished for her. She looked at me closely. "How are you holding up with this? Personally?" I looked at the folder. "Professionally? I'm fine. Personally, it's complicated." The burden of confidentiality was heavy. I would talk to Richard on the phone, and he would tell me how well Ethan's command inspection had gone. I had to stay silent, knowing information that could end that career. The investigation reached its breaking point on a Thursday afternoon. An investigator called me, his voice noticeably grimmer than usual. "We received additional testimony today," he said. A witness came forward voluntarily. My grip tightened on my pen. "Regarding what?" "Potential retaliation," he replied, "against a subordinate who reported concerns about his conduct." My heart sank. In the military, a leadership mistake can be coached, poor judgment can be corrected. But retaliation? Retaliation is a terminal offense. It strikes at the very heart of the chain of command. If this was true, Ethan wasn't just in trouble. He was finished. I sat in my office as the sun went down, the fading light casting long shadows across the file. I didn't feel any satisfaction. I didn't feel like the gold digger had finally gotten hers. I felt a profound sense of sadness. I had spent 36 years watching institutions succeed or fail based on whether people felt safe telling the truth. Now, I had to find out if my own family had been the one trying to silence it. One of the witnesses was a lieutenant who had served under Ethan's command about 18 months prior. According to the official records, the officer had raised concerns regarding several questionable decisions Ethan had made. It wasn't anything criminal or overtly dramatic, simply professional concerns. Yet, shortly afterward, the lieutenant's responsibilities were curtailed. Assignments were shifted, opportunities for advancement vanished. The timing was far too precise to be ignored. The lead investigator summarized these findings during a high-level briefing. When he finished, a heavy silence hung over the room for several seconds. Everyone present understood the gravity of what had been presented. While the evidence wasn't definitive yet, it was deeply concerning. I remained quiet throughout the entire discussion, listening intently and taking meticulous notes. I was doing exactly what my position required. Nothing more, nothing less. That evening, Richard called. The moment I heard his voice, a knot of guilt tightened in my stomach. It wasn't because I had done anything wrong, but because I was carrying a weight of knowledge that I was legally and professionally forbidden from sharing with him. "How was your day?" he asked, his voice warm and unsuspecting. "Busy," I replied, keeping my tone neutral. "Everything okay?" "Just work, Richard." He laughed softly on the other end of the line. "That's your answer for everything." Perhaps it was. For decades, I had mastered the art of compartmentalizing my professional duties from my personal life. Most of the time, that skill served as my shield. But this time, the secret felt far too heavy to hold. Richard began talking about a fishing trip he was planning and a neighbor who had just purchased a new boat. They were normal, ordinary things, the kind of mundane conversations married couples have every day. Yet, throughout the entire call, my mind was elsewhere. I kept thinking about Ethan, about the storm that was gathering, and how much pain was about to descend upon this family. I wondered if any of us were truly ready for it. I certainly wasn't sure. 2 weeks later, the investigation reached its tipping point. A review board convened to analyze the additional findings and testimonies. By then, the pattern of behavior was impossible to dismiss. No single incident would have been enough to derail Ethan's career. The issue was the sheer accumulation of missteps. It was 100 small decisions. It was 100 moments where humility should have prevailed, and 100 opportunities to listen that had been ignored. Leadership failures rarely strike like lightning. They grow slowly, like hairline cracks in a foundation invisible, until the day the structure begins to lean. The board reached a preliminary conclusion. Formal administrative action was warranted. Ethan's promotion consideration would be suspended pending a final review. 3 days later, the situation exploded. It didn't happen publicly or in the media, but within the internal channels of the Navy. Word had reached Ethan, not the granular details, but just enough to let him know that his career was under serious scrutiny. I wasn't there when he received the news, but accounts suggested he reacted exactly as many high-achieving people do when faced with unexpected failure. First came disbelief, then a flash of anger, followed by a fierce determination to fight. He requested clarifications, documentation, and formal meetings. It was all within his rights. Every officer deserves due process. Yet, as the process unfolded, a more painful truth emerged. Ethan had never imagined he could be the subject of such an investigation. For years, his success had insulated him from self-doubt. Now, that insulation was being stripped away, layer by layer. A few days later, I was reviewing reports when my assistant stepped into my office. "You have a visitor," she said, her voice hesitant. That hesitation told me everything I needed to know. "Who is it?" "Ethan Collins." For a moment, neither of us spoke. I checked my watch. No appointment, no scheduled meeting. He was simply standing outside my door. I understood immediately. The investigation had finally hit home, and now he was looking for answers I couldn't give. "Send him in," I said. My assistant nodded and stepped aside. Ethan entered the room. The polished confidence I was accustomed to seeing was still there, but it was shadowed by something new. Genuine concern. He closed the door firmly behind him. "Margaret." "Ethan." For several seconds, we stood in a tense stalemate. No smiles, no pleasantries. Finally, he broke the silence. "I have a question." I gestured toward the chair opposite my desk. "You can ask." He sat down slowly, leaning forward as if trying to read my expression. "I heard something today." I remained silent, waiting. "Someone mentioned your office," he continued. Still, I gave him nothing. Then came the question that had been 3 years in the making. "What exactly is it that you do for the Navy?" I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, but because after 3 years of family dinners and countless assumptions, he was only now curious enough to ask. "My position is not relevant to your current situation, Ethan." "It is to me," he snapped, his voice a mix of frustration and burgeoning realization. The confusion in his eyes interested me. It suggested that the foundation of his assumptions was finally beginning to crumble. "Ethan, you should focus on your own responsibilities right now." He stared at me, clearly unsatisfied, then stood up and left without another word. The full realization arrived the following week, not from my mouth, but through official Navy channels. As part of the administrative procedure, Ethan was granted access to documents connected to the oversight process. Within those files were organizational charts, reporting chains, and titles. Names and facts, the kind of cold, hard facts that don't care about a person's preconceived notions. A few hours later, Richard called. His voice sounded stunned. "He knows," Richard said breathlessly. I closed my eyes. The moment had finally arrived. "What happened?" Ethan came to the house. He thought there was some kind of mistake. I understood perfectly. For 3 years, Ethan had meticulously constructed an image of me, the gold digger, the wealthy widow hunter, the retiree living off his father's success. Now, that image had collided with reality, and reality had won. Richard sighed heavily. He kept asking the same thing over and over. What question? Why didn't anyone tell me? I looked out the window toward the Washington skyline. The answer seemed painfully obvious. Nobody had hidden the truth. He simply had never cared enough to ask. The final review concluded 2 weeks later. The findings were clear. No criminal corruption or fraud, but significant. Documented failures in leadership. His promotion was officially suspended, and his reputation took a devastating hit. For the first time in his adult life, Ethan Collins learned that talent alone could not shield him from accountability. A week later, an unexpected request appeared in my inbox. It didn't come through official channels or lawyers. It was a personal request, simple and direct. Commander Ethan Collins was asking for a private meeting not with the Inspector General, but with his stepmother. Somehow, that frightened me more than the investigation ever had. I had spent my career preparing for difficult conversations. I had informed families of casualties and delivered career-ending news. But none of that prepared me for this. This wasn't an official meeting with regulations and checklists. It was just two people carrying years of misunderstanding into a quiet room. He asked to meet at my home rather than the office, a gesture I appreciated. Whatever was said next belonged to the family, not the Navy. Richard was away visiting a friend, so the house was still. The Chesapeake Bay shimmered beyond the deck, a warm breeze rustling the trees. It was a peaceful afternoon, yet I felt a profound sense of nerves. I didn't know which version of Ethan would walk through the door. At exactly 2 p.m., the doorbell rang. Military punctuality, some habits never die. When I opened the door, he looked older, not just physically, but emotionally. The toll of the past few weeks was etched into the dark circles under his eyes. Margaret. Hi, Ethan, come in. We sat at the kitchen table, the same place where Richard and I shared breakfast every morning. I poured the coffee, and after a minute of strained small talk, silence settled between us. I owe you an apology, Ethan said finally, staring into his cup. I waited, letting the silence hold the space for him. I've treated you badly, he admitted. It was the most honest thing I had ever heard him say. I convinced myself you married Dad for his money. I know, I replied softly. And I told other people. I know that too. His face tightened with a mix of embarrassment and regret. What makes it worse is that I never had any evidence. He was right. Everything had been a story he'd written in his own mind. Eventually, he looked up and asked the question again. Why didn't you tell me who you were? I never hidden who I was, Ethan. I just never shouted it. You know what I mean. Actually, I don't. You never asked about my career. You never asked where I served or what I did for 35 years. His eyes dropped. I wasn't trying to twist the knife. I was simply stating facts. And facts have a way of hurting all by themselves. You're right, he whispered. The conversation shifted then. For the first time, he asked real questions. He wanted to know about my childhood in rural Ohio, about joining the Navy at 18, and the reality of a 35-year career, the deployments, the missed Christmases, and the price of service that most people never see. I saw his internal image of me falling apart, piece by piece. Eventually, he asked, "Were you angry?" "Sometimes," I admitted. "Why didn't you say anything?" I laughed softly. "Because arguing wouldn't have changed your mind. You weren't looking for information, Ethan. You were looking for confirmation." He stared at me, understanding exactly what I meant. We talked for over 2 hours before we finally reached the one subject we had both avoided. His mother, Susan. "I think I hated you before I even met you," he said, his honesty startling. "Why?" "Because you weren't her. When Dad started dating again, I felt like moving on meant forgetting her." The pieces finally clicked into place. The hostility hadn't been about money. Money was just the excuse. The real wound was unresolved grief. I reached across the table and placed my hand over his. "Your mother would want you to be happy, Ethan." His eyes filled with tears, and he looked away, embarrassed. But at 31 years old, he was finally allowing himself to feel the loss he had been running from for years. As he stood to leave, he asked one final question. "Do you think I deserve a second chance?" I looked at him for a long moment. "I think everyone deserves a second chance, Ethan. But not everyone is willing to do the work required to earn one." The relief on his face vanished, replaced by a somber understanding. The investigation's consequences weren't going away. His promotion was still suspended, and his record was tarnished. But for the first time, I believed he was ready to take responsibility. In the months that followed, something unexpected happened. Ethan didn't resign, and his career didn't end. Instead, he got better. He listened more and interrupted less. He sought feedback and accepted criticism without getting defensive. A commander who had known him for years called me to say Ethan seemed different, humbler, and a better leader. I felt a surge of pride, not because he had succeeded, but because he had chosen to change. 8 months later, we had a family barbecue. The atmosphere was light, the old tension having faded into the background. At one point, I overheard Ethan talking to a relative who asked how I knew so much about the military. "My stepmother spent decades serving this country," Ethan said, his voice sincere. "She's one of the finest officers I've ever known." He used the word stepmother, not Dad's wife, not the gold digger. He claimed me as family. As I look back, I realize this wasn't a story about revenge. The greatest victory wasn't seeing Ethan face consequences. It was watching him become a better man because of them. Life has taught me that the people who hurt us are often carrying wounds we cannot see. Understanding those wounds can sometimes accomplish what anger never will. So, if there is someone in your life you've misunderstood, or someone who has misunderstood you, perhaps the lesson is this: ask one more question before you make your final judgment. You might be surprised by what you learn.